Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The topic today is portal hypertension and ascites. And in today's talk we will talk about these important aspects of portal hypertension and the ascites. What is the definition? An elevation of portal pressure above 10 millimeter of mercury or 30 centimeter of saline, or an intrasplenic pressure of more than 17 millimeter of mercury, or the wedge hepatic venous pressure more than 4 millimeter mercury above the hepatic vein or inferior vena cava pressure is the definition of portal hypertension. So normal pressure is about 5 to 6 millimeter of mercury, and when this pressure exceeds more than 10, this constitutes portal hypertension. This is the brief anatomy of the portal vein and portal venous system. The portal vein is formed by the union of the superior mesenteric vein and the splenic vein at the level of L2 behind the neck of the pancreas, and it is joined directly by the left gastric vein, the right gastric vein, and the pancreaticoduodenal artery, and the umbilical vein. It also joins the left branch of the portal vein. The portal vein then divides into its right and left branches, and then they enter into the liver. So portal system, it includes all veins which carry blood from digestive tract, spleen, pancreas and gallbladder to the liver via the portal vein. The portal vein is about 6 to 8 centimeter long and is 12 millimeter in diameter. An important feature is that it does not contain any valves, and hence the pressure is same in all parts of portal venous system. The portal vein is responsible for supplying about 70 to 80% of the total amount of the blood to the liver, and about 20 to 40% of the oxygen supply to the liver. The remaining 20 to 30% of the blood and major oxygen supply is by the hepatic artery. Another important feature of portal system is that it begins as capillaries in the mesentery of the intestine and spleen, and it also ends as capillaries in the liver. Very briefly about the pathophysiology of the portal hypertension. According to Ohm's law, the pressure in any circulation is dependent on two factors. Number one is resistance to the outflow, and number two, the volume of the blood which is flowing in that particular circulation. So, in case of portal hypertension, both these factors, the increase in the resistance and the increase among the blood flow, they are contributing towards the overall pathophysiology of portal hypertension. It is generally considered that the initial factors in the pathogenesis of portal hypertension is increased resistance to the portal blood flow. This increase in the portal vascular resistance leads to gradual reduction in the flow of portal blood to the liver, and simultaneously it leads to development of the collateral vessels, and the development of these collateral vessels allows portal blood to bypass the liver and enter into the systemic circulation directly. And these collaterals, they develop when the pressure gradient between the portal and the hepatic vein, it increases above a certain threshold. Normal gradient is about 4 millimeter of mercury, and when this is increased to more than 6, this leads to significant portal hypertension and development and formation of these collaterals. In addition to the opening, dilatation and hypertrophy of the pre-existing blood vessels, there is also an element of angiogenesis in the formation of the new collateral vessels. At the same time, after the resistance is increased due to the effect of various hormones and other factors, the portal blood flow is also increased due to subclinic vasodilatation, and this increased blood flow is then responsible for maintaining and aggravation of the portal hypertension. This subclinic vasodilatations and increased blood flow is also associated with systemic hyperdynamic circulation, with decreased peripheral vascular resistance in the systemic arteries and increase in the cardiac output. The stellate cells, the ito cells, they also play a significant role in the pathogenesis of the portal hypertension, and they contribute significantly towards the increased vascular resistance which is seen in patients with chronic liver disease. The liver cell injury, which is a hallmark feature of this chronic liver disease, leads to activation of these stellate cells, and these stellate cells, after activation, they transform themselves into myofibroblast, and then there is also de novo expression of specific smooth muscle proteins, the alpha actin, and in addition the various other factors which are vasodilators and the vasoconstrictors like endothelin 1 and the various prostaglandins, especially the prostacyclins and nitropside. They also help in transformation and contraction of these activated stellate cells, and this results in abnormalities of the blood flow pattern and the increased amount of the fibrogenesis which is associated with activation of the stellate cells. It also contributes in a mechanical way about disturbed vascular pattern and increase in vascular resistance, and this increased resistance to blood flow is the initial factors in the pathophysiology of portal hypertension, and later on this is maintained and aggravated by the increased blood flow through splanchnic vasodilatation. The increased pressure in the portal circulation, the blood is diverted into the collateral channels, and some of the blood, it bypasses the liver cells and is shunted directly into the hepatic venous radicals which are present in the fibrous septa, and these portohepatic anastomosis, they develop from pre-existing sinusoids which are enclosed in the septa. This is a diagrammatic pattern of the abnormal pattern of the blood flow and the responsible increase in vascular resistance in patients with cirrhosis, which is the most common cause of portal hypertension. On the left you can see the normal sinusoidal blood flow, and about 70 to 80% blood flow in the sinusoids is coming from the portal vein, and the remaining 20 to 30% is through the hepatic artery. But with the cirrhosis and development of regenerative nodules and excessive fibrosis, these sinusoids which are now entrapped in these nodules, they become divorced from their portal blood supply, and they are nourished mainly by the hepatic artery. And obstruction to the portal blood flow is partially due to the nodules which compress the hepatic venous radicals. So there is element of mechanical compression and mechanical obstruction to the blood flow, and that is mainly responsible for increase in the vascular resistance. The increase in vascular resistance, which is the initial factor in the pathogenesis of portal hypertension, has two main components. One is mechanical, the other is dynamic. The mechanical component, which is not modifiable, is through fibrosis, the nodules which disturb the whole architecture of the liver, and the deposition of the collagen in space of Dizzy, and this leads to obstruction to the lymphatic flow. The dynamic component of the increased resistance to the portal blood flow is through the activated stellate cells converting themselves into the myofibroblast, and then there are changes in the endothelial cells and the development of the portal collaterals, and this rise in the portal pressure then leads to development of the portosystemic collaterals and is another way associated with hyperdynamic circulation. The collateral circulations is one very important feature of portal hypertension. Normally 100% of the portal blood flowing to the liver can be recovered from the hepatic veins, but in cirrhosis only 13% of the blood is obtained from the hepatic veins. So the remainder enters into the collateral channels, and these collateral channels, they form four main groups. Group number one are the collateral channels which are formed at the cardiac end of the stomach and at the anus. At the cardiac end of the stomach, the main component of the portal system are the left gastric vein, the posterior gastric veins, and short gastric veins. And remember, the left and right gastric veins, they open directly into the main trunk of the portal vein, and these channels of the portal system, they anastomose with the cable system through the intercostal veins, through diaphragmato-esophageal vein, and the minor azygous veins. So these are group number one of the collaterals, and they are mainly responsible for the formation of the esophageal and gastric varices, and the bleeding from these varices is a hallmark feature of portal hypertension and very important cause of mortality in cases of portal hypertension. The second type of collaterals in this group 1, they are formed at the anus, and here the anastomosis takes place between the superior hemorrhoidal vein, which is the part of the portal system, and it anastomoses with the middle and inferior hemorrhoidal veins, which are part of the cable system. The second group of the collaterals, they are formed at the umbilicus, and this is because of the back pressure transmitted to the umbilical veins, which is opening into the left branch of the portal vein, and in the falciform ligament through the paraumbilical veins, they anastomose with the superficial abdominal veins, and they are responsible for the caput medusae and other vessels seen in the flanks, and the blood flow, direction of the blood flow is away from the umbilicus. The group 3 of these collateral circulation, they are formed where the abdominal organs, they come in contact with retroperitoneal structures, they are adherent to the abdominal walls, and these collaterals runs from the liver to the diaphragm, and in the splenorenal ligament and in the omentum. And the fourth group of these collaterals, they are formed when the portal venous blood is carried to the left renal vein through the blood entering directly from the splenic veins. This left renal veins, it opens into the splenic veins, so the portal pressure when increased is transferred back into the splenic vein, and that pressure is also transmitted into the left renal veins, leading to this group 4 of the collateral circulation. Coming to the classification of portal hypertension, it is convenient to classify the portal hypertension depending upon the site of the abnormality into 3 main categories: the prehepatic, intrahepatic and posthepatic. And the intrahepatic portal hypertension is further subdivided whether this is pre-sinusoidal, sinusoidal or post-sinusoidal. There are certain features which are common to portal hypertension, and they are seen in all cases of portal hypertension, whether this is prehepatic, hepatic or posthepatic. And these 2 features are splenomegaly and the GI bleeding. Additional features, they are seen with the other types of portal hypertension depending upon the site, like with prehepatic portal hypertension, bleeding is a common feature, and these patients, they usually show features of anemia and pallor. In cases of the intrahepatic portal hypertension, where the problem is either in the sinusoids or post-sinusoidal, in addition to splenomegaly and the upper GI bleed, these patients, they also show additional features like hepatomegaly, like abnormal liver functions, jaundice, ascites mild to moderate, and then they commonly show features of hepatic encephalopathy. And when the portal hypertension is post-hepatic, then in addition to splenomegaly and upper GI bleed, these patients, they also show additional features like severe abdominal pain associated with vomiting. The ascites in these patients is usually massive. The hepatomegaly is tender, and they also may have jaundice. In cases of the prehepatic, in cases of the posthepatic portal hypertension, it is mainly the caudate lobe of the liver which is enlarged, and in cases of the intrahepatic type of portal hypertension, mainly the left lobe of the liver shows enlargement. So this diagram shows the main types of portal hypertension and the important etiological factors which are associated with these various types of hypertension, with extrahepatic, prehepatic, which is mainly caused by the congenital abnormalities, are those conditions which lead to umbilicus sepsis, and conditions which are associated with hypercoagulation, and in addition to trauma and malignancy may also be responsible. The intrahepatic causes, they mainly include schistosomiasis, sarcoidosis, congenital hepatic fibrosis, and primary biliary cirrhosis. The sinusoidal type of portal hypertension, main cause is cirrhosis, and every type of cirrhosis can lead to portal hypertension. And then post-sinusoidal may be either in the hepatic veins in the form of veno-occlusive disease, or it may be the involvement of the inferior vena cava after the hepatic vein has joined itself, and this is the Budd-Chiari syndrome. Coming briefly to details of these various types of portal hypertension, the prehepatic portal hypertension results when the abnormality is in the portal vein before it enters into the liver. These patients usually present with the upper GI bleeding and splenomegaly, but as liver is not involved, so liver functions they are normal, and overall the prognosis is excellent. The various causes associated with prehepatic portal hypertension, they include: number one, the various developmental defects like portal vein agenesis, atresia, stenosis, and cavernoma formations. And then second important cause is umbilical sepsis, and this is the most common cause in the developing countries. The umbilical sepsis leads to formation of thrombus in the umbilical vein, and this thrombus and infections is then extended to the left branch of portal vein, and then the portal vein itself is involved and thrombosed, leading to portal hypertension. Trauma may be another important cause, and portal vein thrombosis, which is associated with cirrhosis sometimes and with other hypercoagulable state, may be itself responsible for causing preportal hypertension. And less common causes, they include intra-abdominal infections like acute appendicitis, primary peritonitis, and pancreatitis. And in 50% of the cases, especially in the children, the cause of the prehepatic portal hypertension remains undiagnosed. The main clinical features of the prehepatic portal hypertension, rather every type of portal hypertension, is the upper GI bleeding, which is due to the rupture of the esophageal varices, and the main presentations is in the form of hematemesis, when patient is vomiting out fresh blood, or patient may vomit out the altered blood. And other important presentation is melena, which is the passage of black tarry stools which are sticky, foul smelling, jet black, and offensive odor. And melena results when there is small and slow ooze from the upper gastrointestinal tract or from the lower gastrointestinal tract. Mainly this is a presentation of upper GI bleed, but if the amount of blood is very small, less than 100 cc in 24 hours, and the speed of oozing is also very slow, the melena can also result from the bleeding in the lower gastrointestinal tract, and this is the result of breakdown of the hemoglobin by the bacterial enzymes. And on physical examination, these patients, they are anemic and have pallor. The splenomegaly is a prominent feature, and these patients, they also have stunted growth, and there are multiple reasons, but some of the contributions may be this massive splenomegaly causing compression of the stomach and leading to reduced food intake, or there may be deprivation of the hepatotropic growth factors. And clinically, these patients, they are not jaundiced, there is no hepatomegaly, and there is no ascites. So main features associated with prehepatic portal hypertension are the upper gastrointestinal bleed and splenomegaly. The second type of portal hypertension is intrahepatic, and it is further subdivided into three types, where the abnormality is pre-sinusoidal, sinusoidal, or post-sinusoidal. And because the liver is not involved in pre-sinusoidal type of intrahepatic portal hypertension, so just like prehepatic portal hypertension, the liver functions are usually normal, whereas they are deranged and patient will be clinical jaundice with sinusoidal and post-sinusoidal varieties of intrahepatic portal hypertension. The main causes of pre-sinusoidal portal hypertension, they include chronic active hepatitis, congenital hepatic fibrosis, chronic myeloid leukemia, systemic mastocytosis, sarcoidosis, primary biliary cholangitis, and schistosomiasis. The second variety of intrahepatic portal hypertension, when the sinusoids are involved, and this sinusoidal portal hypertension, the main cause is cirrhosis due to any cause, and the commonest cause we know are chronic infection with hepatitis B and C, various metabolic causes like Wilson disease, hemochromatosis, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiencies, the cholestasis due to any forms, and various types of drugs like the methotrexate, methyl dopa, and isoniazid. And main features, the two features which are common to every type of portal hypertension like splenomegaly and upper GI bleed, and additional feature will include jaundice, ascites, hepatic encephalopathy, and hepatomegaly and caput medusae. Splenomegaly is a hallmark feature of portal hypertension, but sometimes the spleen becomes impalpable following a massive bleed, and this may cause diagnostic confusion. This clinical scenario, when the spleen becomes impalpable after an episode of massive upper GI bleed, is known as Smith-Howard syndrome. It is important to remember that size of spleen, it does not correlate well with the portal hypertension, but usually with portal hypertension we get mild to moderate and sometimes massive splenomegaly. Ascites is a frequent problem in sinusoidal and post-sinusoidal portal hypertensions, and usually this is mild to moderate in quantity. And the post-sinusoidal portal hypertension is when you get the involvement of the terminal hepatic venous radicals, and their involvement is non-thrombotic occlusion of these terminal hepatic venous radicals, and there is no associated abnormality of the hepatic vein or inferior vena cava, and this is known as veno-occlusive disease. And the common causes, they include various toxins like the aflatoxins, various drugs like the cis-mercaptopurine, cyclophosphamide, and vincristine, and the hypervitaminosis A. These various toxins, these drugs, and hypervitaminosis, they lead to changes in the endothelial cells and lead to edema of the endothelium. This endothelial edema leads to proliferation of the fibroblast, and with the excessive proliferation of these fibroblastic cells there is fibrosclerosis, and later on this leads to occlusion of the terminal radicals of the hepatic veins. The post-hepatic portal hypertension, which is the third variety of portal hypertension and is commonly known as Budd-Chiari syndrome, and this has got two main varieties. Number one, the thrombosis of the hepatic veins, and the main factors which are responsible for causing this variety of the Budd-Chiari syndrome, they include thrombosis complicating abdominal trauma, polycythemia rubra vera, various types of neoplasms, systemic lupus erythematosus, cirrhosis, and sickle cell anemia. And the Budd-Chiari syndrome, the second type, results from membranous obstructions of the inferior vena cava after it has been joined by the hepatic veins, and this abnormality can extend from the liver up to the right atrium. The acute blood carrier syndrome is associated with severe abdominal pain and vomiting. These patients, they have mild jaundice and mild to moderate ascites, and chronic blood carrier syndrome is associated with massive ascites, with tender hepatomegaly and upper GI bleed, and with hypertrophy mainly of the caudate tuber of the liver, and compression of the intrahepatic portion of the inferior vena cava can lead to edema of the lower extremities. So, coming briefly to the clinical features, and the main point to be noted in history, they include the cirrhosis, which is the commonest cause, and you have to find out the clinical features associated with cirrhosis. Then history should also focus on past abdominal infectious conditions, and this is important cause of extrahepatic portal vein thrombosis. Various inherited or acquired thrombotic conditions and history of drug intake like sex hormones is important because this predisposed to portal and hepatic vein thrombosis. The commonest presentation of the portal hypertension is upper GI bleed, and the hematemesis is the commonest presentation, but other forms of upper GI bleeds like melena or the occult blood or chronic iron deficiency may sometimes be the presenting features. Another important feature is dilated veins over the abdomen, and they basically result due to total blood flow in the umbilical veins when they anastomose with the superficial abdominal veins, and sometimes they can get the very typical picture of caput medusae when these veins, they are seen radiating from the umbilicus and blood flow is away from the umbilicus, and sometimes you will have other dilated vessels in the flanks or in the upper or lower part of the abdomen, and the blood flow is always away from the umbilicus. The diagnosis of portal hypertension and the imaging studies, they are very helpful. Ultrasonography is very helpful. Then Doppler ultrasonography, it also has got additional information to make a diagnosis of portal hypertension. And then CT contrast arteriography and MR angiography, they may also be helpful in certain conditions. Investigations, the CBC, it will show feature of hypersaplinism when all the three formed elements of the blood, they are decreased, so the RBC count will be low, WBC count will be low, and there will be element of thrombocytopenia. The LFTs will be deranged in cases of sinusoidal and post-sinusoidal and post-hepatic type of portal hypertension, but they remain normal in prehepatic and the pre-sinusoidal type of intrahepatic portal hypertension. The ultrasonography is a very useful investigation for the initial diagnosis of portal hypertension, and the main features which are helpful to make diagnosis, they include dilatation of the portal vein and its diameter is more than 17 millimeter. Then portal vein is not increasing in diameter during inspiration. You can demonstrate the presence of collaterals, and then the splenomegaly, they all helpful. And color Doppler studies, they will assess the pattern of the blood flow and the quantity of the blood flow in the portal vein. The portal hypertension mainly is important because of its various associated complications, and the important complications, they include the formation of varices and the variceal bleed. You can have congestive gastropathy and their intensity becomes more after bending or after sclerotherapy. Massive splenomegaly with features of hypersplenism, ascites, iron deficiency anemia, even renal failure, hepatorenal syndrome, the acute kidney injury type, which is previously known as type 1, or chronic kidney disease type of the hepatorenal syndrome, which was previously known as type 2, and then hepatic encephalopathy. The treatment is according to the manifestations and the complications with which patient presents, and especially for the variceal bleed, there is component of primary prophylaxis and secondary prophylaxis, and this is through the non-selective beta blockers. The propranolol, nadolol, or carvedilol, and the effective dose for the prophylaxis include the dose which will reduce the resting heart rate by 25% or will maintain the pulse rate less than 55 millimeter of mercury. And remember, this prophylaxis has to be continued for the whole life of the patient. This commitment is lifelong, and as soon as you will stop these drugs, the portal pressure will revert back to its normal high values. And coming to one very important complication of portal hypertension, the ascites, we will very briefly discuss about the pathophysiology and the management of the ascites. And overall, 5 main pathological abnormalities are associated with development of ascites in cases of cirrhosis or the portal hypertension, and they include increased portal pressure, hypoalbuminemia, increased retention of sodium, excessive retention of the water, and increased formation of the lymph. So these 5 components: increased portal pressure, low level of serum albumin, excessive formation of the lymph, and excessive retention of sodium and water are involved in the pathogenesis of ascites, which is seen in patients with cirrhosis, which is the commonest cause of portal hypertension and ascites. The decrease in effective circulating volume, which is associated with low level of albumin, and this results from decreased synthetic functions of the liver parenchymal cells, leads to stimulation of the renin angiotensin system, where the decrease in effective circulating volume stimulates the production of renin from the juxtaglomerular cells, and this renin then acts on its substrate, the circulating plasma protein angiotensinogen, and converts it into angiotensin 1, and then by the action of the converting enzyme, it is converted into angiotensin 2, and this angiotensin 2 then exerts its effects through its type 1 and type 2 receptors, and the angiotensin 2 main effects include strong vasoconstriction directly, and then stimulation of the sympathetic outflow from the central nervous system, and excessive formation of the aldosterone from the adrenal cortex, and this aldosterone then leads to absorption of the sodium from the distal convoluted tubules, and in addition, because of the low effective circulating volume and low renal perfusions, there is also more absorption of the sodium from the proximal tubules. In addition, there are high levels of the vasopressin, the antidiuretic hormones, and this impairs the ability of the body to excrete the free water, and this excessive retention of the sodium and the fluid are main component contributing towards the pathogenesis of ascites. In addition, the increased portal pressure by its mechanical effects results in increased pressure within the sinusoids, and this increased pressure in the sinusoids leads to production of a protein-rich fluid from the sinusoids into the hepatic lymphatics, and this results in excessive production of the hepatic lymph, and excessive lymph then enters into the peritoneal cavity and contributes towards ascites. Coming to management of ascites, the most common cause of ascites in Pakistan and in most of the developing countries is liver cirrhosis, which accounts for about 80% of the cases. And in cases of cirrhosis and associated portal hypertension, the ascites is transudate. And one simple test in the diagnosis of ascites of portal hypertension is to assess the SAG ratio. Every patient who is admitted with new onset of ascites, or any patient who is admitted with complication of cirrhosis, should have diagnostic aspirations. Although there is a risk of complications like bleeding, like hemorrhage or perforations, but these complications, they are relatively very small incidence with diagnostic aspirations, and the risk becomes more when you go for therapeutic aspirations. And after the diagnostic aspirations, this fluid should be subjected for biochemical, for cytological, and for bacteriological, and for culture studies. The determination of the difference of the albumin level in the serum and in the ascitic fluid is very helpful to make a diagnosis whether the cause of ascites is portal hypertension or the other etiologies. And this SAG ratio, which is the serum and ascites albumin gradient, and this is calculated by subtracting the quantity of the albumin in the ascitic fluid from the serum albumin level, and if the value is more than 1.1, this in 90 to 95% cases indicates that the cause of this ascites is portal hypertension. So a SAG ratio of equal or more than 1.1 is highly suggestive of portal hypertension as a cause of ascites. And this simple algorithm to reach the cause of ascites, you assess the SAG ratio, and if it is more than 1.1, then the cause is portal hypertension, and if the SAG ratio is less than 1.1, then other causes, mainly infections, inflammations, and malignancies, they may be responsible. And in case of the SAG ratio of more than 1.1, then you calculate the ascitic protein, and if it is less than 2.5, the commonest cause is cirrhosis or the late bud carry syndrome or massive metastasis. And with SAG ratio of more than 1.1 and ascitic protein value also more than 2.5, then the possibilities are congestive heart failure, constrictive pericarditis, early blood carrier syndrome, inferior vena cava obstructions, and post-sinusoidal portal hypertension. And coming to the management of ascites, the number one advice is bed rest. This bed rest is helpful in most of the cases, and patient with mild to moderate ascites, they will get diuresis and the ascites may be significantly reduced. The exact mechanism through which this bed rest helps in the relief of the ascites is not known, but perhaps the upright posture, it activates the sodium retaining mechanisms and it impairs the blood perfusions and stimulates the RAS and helps in excretion, in the retention of sodium and water. And by observing the bed rest, these mechanisms which are contributing towards fluid and sodium retentions, they get cancelled and then patient get relief of the ascites. Because sodium retention and fluid retentions, they play a very significant role in the overall pathophysiology of portal hypertension. So sodium restriction constitutes one very important aspect of management of ascites. In the past, the recommendation was for very strict sodium restrictions, and it was recommended that the daily intake should not be exceeding more than 20 to 25 milliequivalent per day. The normal sodium intake is about 100 milliequivalent per day, and 6 grams of the table salt or simply 1 teaspoon of the table salt will provide this daily required amount of the sodium. And it is recommended that you go for moderate sodium restrictions. That will be helpful, and reducing the daily salt intake between 2 to 4 grams will be helpful in sodium restrictions, and this will provide about 30 to 60 milliequivalents of the sodium, and this will be helpful in management of ascites in most of the cases. We always emphasize on water restrictions because fluid retention is another important contributing factor towards the pathophysiology of portal hypertension. But in ordinary cases where the serum sodium levels they are normal, this fluid restriction is not very helpful. So recommendation is that the fluid intake should only be restricted if the patient shows feature of hyponatremia and the serum sodium level is less than 125 milliequivalent per deciliter, and the daily intake of the fluid may be between 800 to 1 liter of the water. If the patient is not responding to this fluid and water restriction and salt restrictions, then one can use the inhibitors of the ADH receptors, the Vaptans. But remember, the oral Vaptans, they are hepatotoxic and preferably they should be avoided, and in severe refractory cases one can use the IV Vaptans. The mainstay of treatment is the use of diuretics, and the potassium sparing diuretics, they are considered the diuretic of the choice in portal hypertension. The liver cirrhosis and portal hypertension is a state of secondary hyperaldosteronism, and two main mechanisms they are responsible for this state of secondary hyperaldosteronism. Number one, the stimulation of the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, which we just discussed, that will lead to excessive production of the aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. And secondly, because of the less parenchymal function of the liver, this hormone is not properly metabolized in the liver. So excessive production and the reduced metabolism, they are mainly responsible for this case of secondary hyperaldosteronism. So obviously those diuretics which will antagonize the effect of this excessive level of aldosterone will be helpful. So number one choice is the spironolactone, and if that is not producing required amount of diuresis, then one can add the loop diuretic. The starting dose of spironolactone is usually 100 milligram daily or 1 milligram per kilogram, and it is not a very strong diuretic and it exerts its effect slowly. It will take about 2 to 3 days for maximum effect. So adjustment in the dose should only be made after 3 to 4 days, and the daily increment may be again 1 milligram per kilogram or 100 milligram up to the maximum dose of 400 milligram daily. The furosemide is usually started in a dose of 40 milligram, and it is recommended that the ratio of aldosterone to furosemide will be 100 to 140. So for each 100 milligram of the aldosterone, for spironolactone you will add 40 milligram of the furosemide. And how to assess the response to these diuretics? One way is to assess the weight loss, and patient without peripheral edema, the adequate diuresis will be resulting in a daily weight loss of 0.5 kilogram, and if there is also element of edema, then the weight loss should be about 1 kilogram per day. Weight loss more than this value will lead to severe dehydration and will be associated with various complications. Another way to assess the response to diuretic is to assess the excretion of sodium in the urine. Normally patient with portal hypertension and cirrhosis, because most of the sodium is absorbed, so sodium excretion is very low, and values they are less than 10 milliequivalent in 24 hours. On the other hand, the potassium excretion is more, so as far as the electrolyte values in a patient of cirrhosis and portal hypertension is concerned, there will be more potassium and less sodium. With the use of diuretics and effective diuresis, you will have reversal of this ratio. So now the sodium excretion will be more, and it will reach to the value of 60 to 80 milliequivalent in 24 hours, and the potassium excretion will be decreasing. So there are two ways to assess the response to diuretics. One is to weight measurement daily, and second is to assess the spot urine for sodium and potassium excretions. And last, very briefly about the refractory ascites, and when the ascites is not responding to maximum salt restrictions, to fluid restrictions, and to maximum dose of diuretics, then we say that patient has got refractory ascites. And the maximum dose of diuretic is 400 milligram of spironolactone and 160 milligram of furosemide. And there may be two varieties of this refractory ascites. One, when the patient becomes dependent upon, the patient is not responding at all to these diuretic, when we say patient has got diuretic resistant type of ascites. And the other reason to get refractory ascites is when patient is not tolerating this very high dose of these diuretics, and that type is known as diuretic intractable ascites. So the various therapeutic options which are available to deal a patient of refractory ascites, they include serial large volume paracentesis, or the surgical peritoneal venous shunts, or the TIPS, the transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic shunts, and if all these modalities are not working, then liver transplant. And this diagram shows the various modalities. The large volume paracentesis, where you can remove 5 liters of the peritoneal fluid in one sitting. The removal of this amount of peritoneal fluid can lead to circulatory collapse, the post paracentesis circulatory collapse, and to avoid this hemodynamic abnormalities and circulatory collapse, one has to infuse the albumin. And the recommended value is that for each liter of fluid which you remove, you have to give 6 to 8 grams of albumin. And in addition, you can use TIPS, which is a very useful modality and very successful in controlling the refractory ascites, but the major disadvantage is very high association with hepatic encephalopathy and other technical reasons or other technical problems which are associated with these TIPS. The surgical procedures now, they are less routinely performed, but they can be helpful, and ultimate treatment when all these modalities they fail is the liver transplant. So thank you very much.